Given the immense success and popularity of the original Legend of Zelda, a sequel was inevitable. Who could fault Nintendo for fast-tracking a hasty follow-up utilizing the same assets and general framework for a quick profit? Zelda 1 was beloved by all for its advances in open-ended progression and player freedom, and the fans were hungry for more. Zelda 2, subtitled Adventure of Link, released just 1 year after the original on the same hardware in both Japan and America. When players slotted the cartridge in, it quickly became apparent that Nintendo had done anything but play it safe. Instead, the company had taken an enormous risk in tasking a new, hitherto unproven team with reinventing what a Zelda game was. Did this bold departure pay off? Is Zelda 2 an overlooked gem, or is it best forgotten? Say what you want about Zelda 2, but it has to be one of the most fascinating games in the series. I invite you to join me as we dig into what is widely regarded as the black sheep of the franchise. Let's get the boring stuff out of the way first. What did Zelda 2 retain from its predecessor? Well, honestly, not a lot. The basic structure of the game should be familiar to fans of the original. Link is tasked with once again saving Zelda. Same Link, different Zelda, I believe, but don't get me started on the mess that is the Legend of Zelda timeline. In order to rescue the princess, Link must overcome a gauntlet of dungeons that are scattered throughout the world, steadily powering himself up to face greater and greater challenges as he goes. The game doesn't try to break new ground in regard to this framework or story. It's mostly a retread of the original, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. Despite the universally accepted greatness of the original Zelda, the fact that Adventure of Link diverts so sharply from that first game isn't necessarily a bad thing. Who am I to say what a Zelda game should or shouldn't play like? Especially this early in its life, the idea of a Zelda formula didn't exist. If Zelda 2's framework works, then it works. So let's dig into that unique Zelda 2 style and see if it does work. The most obvious change from Zelda 1 to Zelda 2 is that this game is primarily a side-scrolling action game, more in line with something like Castlevania than the top-down grid structure of the original's combat. It is true that Zelda 2 does still retain some elements of the top-down style. Link traverses the much simplified overworld map in this legacy way. The top-down map functions as a hub between the different side-scrolling action levels, dungeons, towns, and random enemy encounters. Yeah, you heard me right, this game has random encounters, and they are as annoying as you might expect. Anyway, anytime Link enters combat, the game zooms into the new side-scrolling gameplay until the battle has ended. I complained about Zelda 1's combat for a large portion of my critique on that game, so you're probably curious about how I like this completely new system. The side-scrolling combat certainly isn't perfect, but I actually had a lot of fun with it, and would posit it as this game's greatest strength. Link feels great to control, and his movements are extremely responsive, a clear improvement on the awkwardly limited movement of the original. The combat just feels so much more active here. Link has a wealth of options when facing enemies now. He can dodge attacks by backpedaling or leaping out of harm's way. He is able to alternate between a standing and a crouched stance. Switching between the two is essential in order to block attacks at the correct height. Eventually, Link is even given special additional sword techniques, the upward and downward thrust, which often gives Zelda 2 the feeling of a platformer. The downward thrust in particular needs to be discussed. The way a successful pogo bounce can be used to bypass an enemy without taking damage is endlessly useful, and it just feels so good to pull off. Learning the best ways to exploit this move is a blast, and it's no surprise that this single move has been an inspiration in the development of so many future games. Notable examples being the classic DuckTales and indie darling Shovel Knight. The list of options Link has for combat doesn't end there, but I want to save discussion about the magic system for a bit later. The player's control over Link's action is only half of what goes into a satisfying combat encounter. It would all be for naught if the enemy's design wasn't able to hold up to the careful thought that went into Link's moveset. Thankfully, this isn't the case. There is a wide range of enemies to face off against, and I found that I needed to consider how best to approach each one, as different enemies really do require different tactics here. Whether it's just a subtle difference in timing, a unique movement pattern, or a quirk in their programming, these enemies require thought to conquer. I honestly can't say the same for Zelda 1, so it thrills me that this is the case. I actually just completed a run through of Dark Souls while I was writing the script to this video, and it just dawned on me how similar the combat is between these two games. Dark Souls combat is renowned for the measured dance it forces between player and foe. Impatience is brutally punished, and players are forced to exploit every little opening or advantage they can take. Obviously, all of this is far more simplified on the 2D plane of Zelda 2, but the same elements are at work. The Iron Knuckle is the clear pinnacle of this philosophy in Zelda 2's enemy design. The knuckle alternates between low and high swipes, and the player must in turn alternate stances in order to avoid damage. Before long, you get into this great back and forth of blocking and occasionally retaliating when an opening appears. It creates this awesome rhythm that I never got sick of. You have the option of pogoing off the Iron Knuckles helmets, not to cause damage but to reposition, or just to flee the fight. There is even the secret weakness that Iron Knuckles have on their faces. The timing is quite tricky, but if you master it, this allows you to wipe the floor with these guys. While I'm pushing this Dark Souls comparison, I might as well mention the obvious point that Dark Souls is infamous for its brutal difficulty. Make no mistake, Zelda 2 is one of the toughest games I've ever played. I'm man enough to admit to requiring the use of save states in order to finish the game. I have no idea how kids in the 80s managed. This difficulty is best seen in the dungeons of the game. These challenging gauntlets are once again mostly combat rather than puzzle focused, but that isn't so much of a problem when the combat in this game is this satisfying. Instead of interconnected rooms, these dungeons are continuous corridors connected by elevator shafts. They are easier to navigate on the whole, but the possibility of getting lost is always there. Thankfully, bombs and thus hidden bombable doors are absent, but Zelda 2 isn't afraid to pull a few cheap tricks of its own. The biggest annoyance with these new corridor designs that was never present with the interconnected grids is the mandatory backtracking through a previously cleared area, but it's not that bad. The bosses are a real high point of each dungeon, a nice reward for reaching the end. While a couple bosses are just tougher versions of regular enemies, several of the designs this time around are particularly memorable. Barba's whack-a-mole fight and Thunderbird's bullet hell test definitely stand out, but the crowning jewel couldn't be anyone other than Dark Link. The way Link's shadow separates to form this doppel is simply awesome, and the fight that follows is my favorite part of the entire game. Dark Link possesses a copy of Link's moveset and fights with such relentless aggression that the encounter is thrilling throughout. Being forced to confront your double is such a common trope these days that it might seem trite, but Dark Link holds up. He's reappeared several times in future games, but his beginnings are with this game. One miscellaneous little quality of life improvement made in Zelda 2 is that the dungeons will crumble once complete. This means that if the dungeon does not crumble after defeating the boss, the player knows they missed an important item within. If the dungeon crumbles, the player can cross that location off their list when trying to find the way to move forward. This was not the case in Zelda 1. Players were given no indication if an essential item was hidden within a previously completed dungeon, and were forced to comb through it again. I still yearn for the future methods of dungeon design where an item's usage is required within its own dungeon to progress. This would be a much more natural and clever way to ensure nothing gets left behind, but at least the developers of Zelda 2 recognized this flaw from the previous game and sought to correct it. Even if their method is a bit shoddy, I find it important to commend this fix. With how strong I consider the side-scrolling in this game, I find it so awkward that the game retains the top-down overworld from Zelda 1, because it's such a neutered counterpart to the map of that game. There are almost no options for non-linear progression here. The game confines Link to a section of the map at a time, shamelessly positioning hard roadblocks to keep the player on the developer's chosen path. If you watched my previous video, you'll recall that the open-ended exploration of Zelda 1 was that game's biggest draw, so it is disappointing that it's already nearly forgotten in the very next entry. I hate to keep bringing up comparisons to Zelda 1, but I think it's necessary to illustrate just how lazy I find the Zelda 2 map. There are relatively fewer secrets, and the ones that do exist usually just require you to walk over a specific tile. I'm not going to say that bombing walls and burning bushes was particularly engaging, but at least the player had an active role in discovering the secrets. The ones in this game are almost always discovered by complete accident. The player literally stumbled upon the secret square. It's not memorable. Even if there were a wealth of things to discover in the world, which there isn't, I still don't think I would have been motivated to explore it. The aforementioned shift to side-scroller combat when a wandering blob touches Link is so jarring it completely disincentivizes unnecessary movement. By the time I return to the map, I've already lost all motivation to continue exploring. It's like being dragged into an entirely different game every couple of steps with no say in the matter. If I have to get from point A to point B in Zelda 2, you better bet I'm taking the absolute shortest path possible to minimize these interruptions. That being said, I freely admit there are a few cool bits to the new map. Death Mountain is like a series of interconnected tunnels that requires experimentation and memorization to figure out the correct path through. It runs the chance of driving the player into a frustrated rage, but it stood out to me. Maze Island offers a more traditional maze, go figure. It was fun to navigate and never reached frustration levels. As interesting as areas like this are, they too are marred by the incessant random encounters that plague exploration. The way the map is zoomed out also leads to this unavoidable disconnect for me. It's hard to describe, but I never feel like I'm controlling Link during these portions, more like I'm moving a board game piece around the map. The icon is a stand-in for Link, but isn't Link, if that makes sense. I can't say if others will be bothered by this, but it really hurt my enjoyment personally. This is going to sound crazy, but I honestly think the game would be better off totally eschewing a world map and just using a plain old level select. A lot of personality might be lost, but the game needs to lean into the strength of its combat and trim the weaker elements. Plus, the weird scale of the map just makes it look so unappealing to me. Like, I can't be the only one who thinks this looks downright hideous, right? Clearly the original isn't much of a looker anymore either, but this is undoubtedly a step backwards for me. Along with the new combat system, the other massive departure from Zelda 1 is the new emphasis on role-playing elements. Obviously the game employs an active battle system, so it isn't like Zelda 2 is intruding on Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, but this shift closer to an RPG is unique in the series. Instead of rupees, the new reward for defeating enemies is experience points. Point bags are even used as a reward for exploration, just like rupees were in the first game. Link has 3 stats: attack, magic, and life. Attack dictates how much damage the sword can inflict. Health determines how much damage Link will suffer from enemy attacks. And, once again, magic is best saved for its own section. Sorry, but you'll have to be patient with me. Every time Link's experience reaches the next milestone, he is given the option to upgrade a stat or save the points for later. Each stat has 8 levels with higher and higher experience requirements for each. I find it most useful to max out attack first, in order to reduce the time to kill and hopefully reduce opportunities for me to screw up. As with any game with an experience system, the potential for grinding is present, and unfortunately, due to the high difficulty level of the game, I do think some level of grinding will be necessary for most players. Pro tip, these bubbles are an easy way to gain levels in the early game if you can get them stuck in a loop of damage like this. Once a boss is defeated, the player is automatically raised to the next level up point, so try to maximize the free experience given here. In other words, avoid killing the boss when close to a point threshold. Anytime you are forced to restart, all your experience is lost, so little tricks like this can be helpful. The Hyrule of Zelda 1 was packed with secrets, but still had a slight feeling of emptiness. The game did have a few friendly characters, but they were always hidden away underground. Adventure of Link fleshes out its version of Hyrule with numerous towns scattered about the land. Within these towns, a collection of NPCs move about their business independently of Link, which does a lot to make Hyrule feel more like a real place. Each town features both a woman who will fully restore Link's health and one who will restore his magic. Beyond this useful function, it's still worth interacting with everyone to see what they have to say. I can't promise you'll hear any riveting dialogue, this isn't The Witcher 3 after all, but you might find some side quests, another RPG element expanded on in this sequel. The greatest reward is usually a new spell. There's one to obtain in each town. In typical Zelda fashion, the path to completing these objectives is often cryptic to a fault. Take this example. In the town of Saria, a woman will task you with finding her lost mirror. The way to find the mirror is by thinking to interact with this random table in an otherwise empty house. Return to the woman and you will be thanked with a helpful new spell. Due to the limitations of a sprite-based NES game, there is nothing to distinguish this table from the countless others you might have already passed by. Thankfully, you never had to leave Saria Village to complete this quest, so there is a limit on how much time will be wasted looking for this mirror. An even worse example comes in the same town when you are tasked with finding a man named Bagu in order for the riverman to lower the boat and allow you to pass. There is no clue as to where you can actually find this mysterious Bagu. The game expects you to think to leave Saria Town and walk to this exact square to the northeast to get a note from Bagu. If you even walk one square off from this exact spot, Bagu will remain lost. Without the use of a guide, this is beyond unreasonable. And this particular quest must be completed to progress. It isn't optional. Design like this seems crafted just to sell copies of Nintendo Power, and has aged terribly. Alright, I've kept you waiting long enough. Let's dig into magic. I've got to tell you though, after all the build-up, this is going to be very anticlimactic because the magic system is extremely simplistic and leaves a lot to be desired. All told, there are 8 spells to be found throughout the game, some required and some optional. Let's go through them all one by one to illustrate how little imagination was employed here. The life spell is the simplest. It converts some of Link's available magic into health. Extremely useful, but very basic. The counterpart to the life spell is the shield spell, that temporarily reduces the damage Link takes, a kind of advanced healing if you will. There are 3 more spells that offer buffs to Link: Fire, Reflect, and Jump. Fire allows Link to fire the sword beam regardless of his health. Usually this is only possible when he has full HP. The Reflect spell does just what it says to certain magic attacks. Both of these are pretty niche unless facing very specific enemies that necessitate them. The Jump spell turns Link's legs into springs and doubles his jump height. This is a handy spell because it opens up alternative routes and makes bypassing enemies easier. The Thunder spell deals damage to everything on screen, but uses up the lion's share of your magic meter, so it's not one you're going to be using much. Same with the enigmatic spell. In combat, it transforms enemies on screen. It also has a one-time use in yet another of the obscure quests. Maybe my modern expectations are unreasonably high, but not one of these spells is interesting. Jump, Shield, and Life are all useful, don't get me wrong, but they aren't creative in any way. The one exception is the Fairy spell. This transforms Link into a tiny fairy with the power to fly freely about the screen. You are completely vulnerable to attack in this form, but your maneuverability is unparalleled, and it is so fun to activate at just the right moment. There are many utilities for this new form: saving yourself from a fall, reaching an otherwise impossible location, or just for skipping a particularly difficult room of enemies. I love how the uses for this spell aren't all immediately apparent. With the other 7, there is either an extremely narrow use case, or the use is so simple you understand its full utility instantly. Both alternatives are quite boring. We needed more spells like the Fairy spell. As is, the selection of spells is quite basic and underdeveloped. Casting any spell depletes your magic meter. You can lessen this effect by upgrading your magic stat, and by finding secrets that expand your meter. But you will still frequently find yourself running out of magic. Once again, this introduces grinding into the equation. If you know that you need to use the jump spell to reach a higher platform, but don't have enough magic, you just have to kill every enemy on screen and hope to get a little refill. Or, even worse, sometimes you have no choice but to intentionally die in order to refill your meter. I don't have an easy solution to this problem, but it is extremely annoying when it happens. When looking back on older games like this one, there are always design decisions that are just perplexing from a modern vantage point. These are impossible to ignore when playing the game today, and you just have to wonder what the developers were thinking. For example, Zelda 2 has a live system. This adds absolutely nothing to the experience, it only detracts. Link starts out with 3 lives, and loses one anytime his health meter depletes, or he falls into a bottomless pit. With the steep difficulty of the game, you'll be seeing a lot of this game over screen. When you resume play after a game over, you will spawn back at the starting screen, and will lose any experience points you haven't cashed in. Losing experience doesn't bother me too much, but it's the forced retracing your steps that infuriates me. It just wastes so much of the player's time. What does it add? There isn't any way to permanently raise your life count, even though there are several hidden 1-up dolls to be found. These would have actually been an amazing incentive to explore if they permanently raised your life count to help make these game overs more avoidable. But that would have been too easy, I guess. Instead, they are a one-time use. There are a very finite amount of 1-ups to be found on the map, 6 total, and they don't respawn after death. As is, they are so inconsequential you have to wonder if they are worth the programming time. In my personal opinion, the vast majority of games that employ a live system would have been better off without them, and they absolutely have no place in a Zelda game. It's telling that Adventure of Link is the sole Zelda game to pull this stunt, and it reeks of sloppy design. Zelda 1 and 2 make such an interesting case study because they really are completely different visions. The developers of Zelda 2 chose to pave their own path, rather than iterate on Zelda 1, and I applaud that. The combat system has definitely stood the test of time and is a marked improvement over what its predecessor offered. You can still see some of Zelda 2's influence today in that respect. That being said, it's admittedly a very flawed game. This game abandoned just about everything that made the original legendary. The player-driven, open-ended design is sorely missed, and there are so many little quirks where Zelda 2 just feels amateur in comparison. For a series that historically likes to play it safe and traditional, it's fascinating how loose Nintendo was with the IP on this second entry. That being said, the legacy of the franchise is built on the foundation of Zelda 1, not Zelda 2, and that's okay. Adventure of Link can have its own legacy. It just might be separate from The Legend of Zelda.